don't believe the denials, but the thing you can believe is the broad strategic narrative that these dictators, these predator nations tell about national greatness and their return to their former glory and their imperial glory and all of that, because that tells you the real story. The denials are just a tactical part of waging warfare on your country.
The Pentagon once said that Russia's invasion of Ukraine could succeed in 3 days. So as the war rages on more than 4 years later, what else have world leaders got wrong? For one thing, what a nation's most important source of power is. Today, international and political editor Peter Hartcher on the underestimated power that Ukraine holds and what it would take for us to acquire it. So Tuesday marked 4 years since Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and you have just written that these 4 years of nonstop violence have a number of important lessons to teach all of us, really, about the reality of the world that we're now living in. No big deal. So, Hartcher, tell us about these lessons.
Absolutely. And I think everybody is astonished that with such a mismatch of size, Ukraine has been able to survive for 4 long years and is entering the 5th year with no sign that it's coming to any sort of conclusion. A country that was ranked 25th in the world in terms of its military firepower, which is Ukraine, and today has about 30 million people, against the country that was ranked number 2 in the world for military power, Russia, which has about 140 million people. That mismatch is astonishing. So that alone makes it a fascinating topic for study. What can we learn? One is the importance of having, this is part of the traditional hard power definition of a national strength. That is the economic and technological capability to produce the high quality military and technology gear that you need across the full spectrum of needs and to produce it rapidly and consistently. One strategist, Phillips P. O'Brien, has put it this way: don't think so much about how many tanks you have, but think about the system that produced those tanks. Do you have a system that can produce quality tanks, adapt in a great hurry? And tanks are just a symbol, right? I mean, there's drones and all other munitions, missiles have to be encompassed by this as well. But the second one is the critical importance of allies, because neither Russia nor Ukraine could have survived this long by itself or by themselves. Ukraine obviously has had the essential support from Europeans and sometimes the US. Russia has had the vital support of China, without its fiscal support and its tech support, Russia would have collapsed. A third one is the importance of endurance. Wars aren't short. Wars now last years, and the Ukraine-Russia one is a good example, where the Pentagon said that Ukraine could collapse in 3 days and Putin would be in Kyiv. Well, no. So a country has to be prepared to supply itself, regenerate its strength for years and years, especially a small country up against a formidable larger ally. And I've saved the most important to last. The most important lesson from Ukraine, I think, is the essential, critical central value of willpower. The sheer determination of a country, of a people, because that's what a country is, it's its people, to stand and survive in the face of overwhelming odds.
Okay, I really want to ask you about that last one. You say it's the most important, which is so interesting because I would have thought that willpower, that the idea that is sort of crucial to a nation's survival, doesn't that completely upend conventional understanding of a nation's most important source of power?
It does, and that is exactly why the Pentagon got Ukraine so wrong, because they just looked at a conventional analysis, number of missiles and fighter jets on the one team and the equivalent on the other team, and see how they match. Well, it turns out that, in this case, turned out to be almost irrelevant. Not entirely, but almost irrelevant.
So tell us, how is that actually manifested, that the willpower is what's enabled Ukraine to defy the Kremlin for so long against really all expectations?
Yeah. Well, a couple of examples. When the invasion began, hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians rushed to volunteer. Hundreds of thousands.
Yeah.
Now, of course, eventually they pretty quickly had to turn to conscription. The Russians too, of course. The Russians have been signing up prisoners and mercenaries and North Koreans and anybody they can get their hands on simply to field enough troops. But the contrast with the Russians is stark. Nobody in Russia wants to fight. And one manifestation of that is that the Russians commonly use something called blocking troops. Blocking troops are the Russian soldiers who stand behind the front lines with their guns ready to shoot any Russian soldiers who try to retreat.
That's brutal.
Right. So they're desperately, trying to prevent their own soldiers from running away. Of course, the Ukrainians have some problems with people who don't want to go to the war and all of that. Any population would. But in the Russian case, it's structural, it's endemic. And according to Zelensky, the Russians are signing up about 40,000 new fighters a month, of whom 35,000 are becoming either casualties, either injured or killed. So they're just churning through these people, and nobody wants to be the next into the mincemeat machine. The Ukrainians, the will to fight is much greater. Partly you could attribute that to the fact that Ukraine's survival is under threat, Russia's isn't, and that gives a more desperate edge to the Ukrainian defenders. But really this national, overwhelming, whole-of-nation commitment to this cause, starting from the leader, you'll remember Zelensky, I don't need a ride, I need ammo.
Вам треба терміново залишити Україну. Ми готові в цьому допомогти. І я тут відповів, що мені потрібна зброя, а не таксі.
All the way down to, the people who can't fight but support the war effort in 1,000 different ways.
Okay, so let's talk about this idea that Ukraine has this whole-of-nation support for the defense of its country. I guess broadly speaking, how does that apply to our security here in Australia? Like, what do we have to learn from that?
What we have to learn is what all complacent Western democracies are beginning to appreciate, and that is that we need to change. We are completely unprepared. The realization started earlier in Europe. Half a dozen European countries are now resuming some form of military service, not conscription, but some element of requirement on younger people across Europe to participate in the defence of their countries. Just today in Canada, the Globe and Mail, which is one of the leading papers, has a piece saying Canada might have to fight an all-out war. Are young Canadians prepared? And of course, the answer is no.
Wow.
But it's the same across all the Western democracies that have sheltered under American protection and alliances since World War II are now realizing they're on their own.
So I guess tell us, what is the state then of our people, our collective whole, our psyche, our mental preparedness, or thinking about how we would endure against a larger predator? Because essentially that's what you're saying Ukraine has. They may be tiny, they're against a nation that has nuclear weapons. How are we going here, Peter?
Not so well. Two recent polling illustrations. There was a poll 2024 by the IPA, the Institute for Public Affairs, which found that about half of Australians would be prepared to fight in the event of a war, an attack on their country, and 30% would leave the country. Last year, the Lowy Institute asked a very similar question and had a very similar answer. I think 52% of Australians said they would be prepared to fight if they were physically capable of doing so, and about 25% said they wouldn't, and the rest were in the don't know category. I suppose the threat seems too abstract from our daily lives. It's difficult to imagine. But this brings us to the critical importance of leadership, of a country's leadership preparing its people for potential crisis. It needn't be a full-scale invasion. The prospect of a full-scale invasion of Australia, for example, is close to zero. But we can certainly have our national survival threatened, and if our rivals succeed, destroyed. We can lose our national sovereignty and self-determination quite easily through, for example, one that's Australian war planners have been gaming for in recent years, and that is a naval blockade of Australia, so that we can't export or import anything other than what the rival in this illustrative case obviously is China, which has already tried to use trade coercion and political coercion. Why not step it up a notch? They've been practicing a naval blockade against Taiwan in recent months. Australia is not, there's absolutely no reason why we would be exempt. So, threats can be real yet not obvious, and that means the leadership, the political class has a duty to prepare its citizens for a crisis, any plausible crisis, and we haven't even addressed the basics of national resilience. The fact that the country still only has about a month stockpile of fuel to keep cars running, to keep jets flying, to keep ships floating, moving.
Wow.
This is a long-standing problem that Australia has known about and yet has failed to address. Pharmaceuticals, we'd run out of pharmaceuticals within 6 to 12 months, so anything you depend on to support your health and life, we would lose access to. So there's a whole raft of national resilience tasks that remain untouched. Not because the government hasn't been told and not because the government doesn't know. It's the Albanese government's own Defence Strategic Review just a couple of years ago found that Australia needed, quote, a whole-of-nation approach to national survival. That whole-of-nation attitude and preparation that the government's Defence Strategic Review proposed remains in the Defence Strategic Review and has gone no further.
Well, that's right. And as you pointed out in your piece, you said, that's where it remains. We're not having these hard conversations. So why aren't we having these hard conversations? Like you said, the government pointed this out, I think it's 3 years ago now in that Defence Strategic Review, set it out very clearly. Why aren't we having these conversations, Peter?
Well, there's the $64 billion question. The first, I would say, is that in general, there's a reluctance in democratic countries for governments to disturb the population with unpleasant or difficult thoughts. They much prefer to governments reassure. Oppositions are happy to sow discontent and alarm, but governments want to reassure. The second thing is the Liberal Party in recent years, under Scott Morrison and Peter Dutton, did try to ring the alarm. Now, they might have overdone it a touch. There might have been a touch of hysteria about it because they thought it would serve their purposes against the Labor Party. But the lesson that they took from it, and the reason they've now fallen not completely silent but largely quiet on this, is that it didn't work for them. It backfired electorally. There are 5 seats in the Australian Federal Parliament where the Chinese Australian population is 20% or more. And the Liberal Party used to have most of them. It lost all of them over the last 2 elections. And the reason seems to be alarm at the Liberal Party's loud banging of the cymbal and the implied division, the wedge that drove between Australia and China and putting Australian Chinese in an uncomfortable position. So the electoral lesson for the Liberals was, whoa, we can't do that anymore. And Labor has simply learned from that it should do the same and simply reassure the Chinese Australian population. Byproduct of that is it doesn't upset Beijing. Xi Jinping remains, shall we say, in the more passive phase in relations with Australia. The federal government, Albanese, calls it stabilisation. Well, you can only be so stable sitting on the top of a volcano because one day that volcano will erupt, but it's not this day, and Albanese is happy to take that.
Well, I wanted to ask you, what would it take for our Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, to, start having these conversations, to signal to our nation it's going to be to our detriment. We don't know when, but it's going to be to our detriment if we don't start talking about the fact that we may not always be enjoying this peace and security that we've had for, since the end of the Cold War.
Yeah.
Because we spoke before recording, Peter, and you said that, Anthony Albanese has, if anything, defending China's, recent sort of naval actions off our coast. So tell us a bit about that, as opposed to sort of taking a hard line. He's really not been taking a hard line, right?
Well, that's right. So that Chinese naval task force that circumnavigated Australia and conducted live fire exercises off Sydney, that was the first time China had ever done such a thing. Albanese did say that Australia would have preferred some notice of that, but rather than criticise it for what it obviously was, which was an attempt to intimidate Australia and an attempt to lay claim to demonstrate that it has the military reach and the political intent of dominating the entire region, which has been in its leaders' speeches for years, by the way. But this was a very real and concrete manifestation of that rhetoric. Rather than criticise it, Anthony Albanese made excuses for it and said, we conduct similar exercises in the South China Sea all the time.
But given Australia has a presence from time to time in the South China Sea, its location is hinted at there by the title of the sea, that we engage in activities that are lawful. This activity took place outside of our exclusive economic zone. Notification did occur of this event. What we have done is make representations saying that we think best practice would be to give more notice. And we've done
so, in other words, drawing an equivalence. It's an equivalence that doesn't exist because the South China Sea is the world's most important strategic artery where multiple countries have been conducting freedom of navigation operations for decades. And that freedom of navigation is under active threat because of the Chinese government's territorial claims and ambitions and realising those by reclaiming islands, building military bases on them and all the rest. There is no threat to, Australia's Antarctic routes. There is no global shipping vital lifeline that passes, between Adelaide and Buenos Aires. There is no such stake and there is no such threat. So it's not equivalent in any way, shape or form. And yet the Prime Minister was going to some lengths to explain that we should think of it as such.
So would you go so far as to say that our Prime Minister has been weak sort of globally, I guess, in comparison with other countries in the way they're perhaps building up or signaling to their nations that we are in a new era now and we need to prepare ourselves? I'm thinking of the announcement that Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney just made on February 16th, announcing that Canada was launching its first ever industrial defense strategy, saying Canada's investing $180 billion in defense procurement, $290 billion in defense and security-related infrastructure. And, he was talking about how defending Canada means more than just increasing the size of our military. It's the strength of the industries and the resiliency of the economy. I guess something perhaps approaching that whole of nation attitude you were talking about. And I'm just wondering, what signal that might have sent Canadians as opposed to, say, the signal that our Prime Minister is sending to us.
Yeah. Well, that's not a bad point because in Australia, the federal government is doing a similar thing with defence industrial capability, building it up, increasing the number of products that Australia can manufacture, autonomous underwater vehicles, aerial vehicles and land vehicles with some lethality. Missile production will start in Australia. Long-range missile production will start in Australia for the first time this year. And of course, the signature is AUKUS. So if you've got all of those expenses going on, tens of billions, in the case of AUKUS, over 50 years, hundreds of billions, doesn't that tell you that the government is actually concerned? And of course, the reality is the official position is that 4 years ago, we had federal governments telling us that our window of warning of imminent crisis was 10 years. Well, that was 4 years ago.
And by imminent crisis, you're referring there to China possibly attacking Taiwan, are you? Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Unspecified, but a military security crisis directly affecting Australia. Okay. So it could encompass Taiwan, but it could encompass many others. So you've got all that going on, and yet at the top, they prefer not to worry anybody. They don't want to create any anxiety. They certainly don't want to lose those vital Chinese-Australian seats that they love to privately will gloat about. Publicly, they dismiss it as a particular target, but that's a reality. The Canadian situation, Mark Carney can and probably must be more outspoken about it, because Canada has been punched in the face by the US.
Directly threatened.
Right on its border.
Yeah.
Trump has made a rhetorical claim to own and occupy all of Canada.
Yes.
So
it's a different situation for sure.
So they've got the crisis on their doorstep, looming over them and threatening them. We don't have anything like that, and maybe that's what it will take, an external crisis to drive the change in rhetoric and change in threat perception among the Australian people. Mind you, I should give some recognition that the Australian public isn't totally ignorant and distracted. The Lowy Institute polls, which is an annual poll about Australians' attitudes to the rest of the world, for several years now have found around 70% of Australians believe that China will be a military threat to Australia within 20 years, I think is the question. So, they're not entirely complacent or absent-minded. They've read the tea leaves. They can see the building threat, but you won't catch the Prime Minister talking about it.
Okay, well, definitely watch that space sort of scenario. But Peter, I guess just to wrap up, what would you say to listeners who are listening to us and they're thinking, hey, we're not under threat, and is China really going to attack Taiwan, which would then embroil us in sort of, possibly a violent conflict? They might point to recent analysis showing that China's own economy would tank if it were to attack Taiwan, because there'd be this loss of, the high-end computer chips that are made in Taiwan that, yes, all of us rely on for our defense and our phones and everything else. But actually so much of China's own economy, of course, relies on. So what if they think of all this and they go, is this conversation alarmist?
Well, I would simply point them to a couple of facts. One of the lessons that we can draw from Ukraine is that not to listen to tactical denials by a potential rival, but look at their grand strategic narrative. Because Russia said, oh, no, Putin said, oh, no, of course we're not going to invade Ukraine, right until the day before it did. And because most countries don't want war, most countries don't want to be invaded, people are beguiled by that and listen to that. He's not going to attack. And the Ukrainians didn't really believe that Putin was about to invade. And the Americans were telling them for weeks, we think they're coming for you. We think it's really serious. And the Ukrainians were saying, no, we don't believe that. So don't believe the denials. But the thing you can believe is the broad strategic narrative that these dictators, these predator nations tell about national greatness and their return to their former glory and their imperial glory.
Interesting.
And all of that, because that tells you the real story. The denials are just a tactical part of waging warfare on your country.
Interesting.
The grand strategic narrative of Russia is, as we know from Putin, it's this nostalgic great Slavic empire, which is essentially a pitch to restore the Soviet Union imperial reach and rebuild a superpower. The same with China. Xi Jinping's, his most famous catchphrases are to create the China dream, to create the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. It's like Trump's Make America Great Again. So they're the grand strategic narratives. Countries have been warned. Ukraine didn't think Russia was serious until the day it happened. I would say to anybody who thinks we're being alarmist, two things. First, read the news. Second, are you feeling lucky?
Are you feeling lucky? Yeah. Well, better to end there, Peter. Thanks so much for your time.
Always a pleasure.